right, let's get started. So to those of you who are here, welcome to the spring 2021 installment of the Warhawk reading series. My name is Professor Gulig, and along with my colleague, Professor Barrett Swanson, I advise the Muse, which is our student-run campus journal of arts and literature. It's open to all students who want to be a part of the organization. It's super fun, and some of like the smartest, at least in my opinion, some of like our smartest, most talented students in the English department are all there. And so along with publishing student creative work, the Muse, every semester we host two visiting writers a semester, and we do this in the hope of trying to foster a kind of more vibrant, more active literary community on our campus, and to put our students who are at the beginning of their journeys in contact and in conversation with people who have walked that road before them. And so over the past 4 years, we've brought in writers from across the country and from across the world, actually. We've brought in writers from Germany, writers from South America, to read and to speak with students. And so the way that this usually works is that the visiting writer will read for a period of time, usually around half hour to 40 minutes. And then in anticipation of their visit, the Muse staff has read their work, has read their books, and has prepared some questions. So the Muse staff will lead a kind of question and answer after Elisa's reading. And that is who we are blessed with today, Elisa Gabbert, all the way from Denver. And to introduce her is our own Katie Childs.
Thank you, Nick. The Unreality of Memory is an outstanding collection of intellectual, exploratory essays on disaster and on what our responses to them say about who we are as individuals and as a society. From 9/11 to the Black Plague to nuclear power plant explosions, Elisa Gabbert takes the reader on an exploration of how to make sense of this temperamental world we live in and how unreal memory can prove to be. With each essay, she seems to be asking, what is happening to our culture right now? What is changing about how we remember history and reflect the present? How does disaster embody our current cultural moment? What does it mean to live in this moment that feels increasingly with every passing day like unreality? Though Ms. Gabbert wrote these essays between 2017 and 2019, each feels eerily like it could have been written today. She writes about illnesses and pandemics as if prophetic about COVID-19. She explains self-perceptive phenomena as if virtual interactions were a constant necessity. She admits to relying too much on news consumption and suffering the emotional consequences. She journeys into insomnia, witch hunting, dangerous biases, compassion fatigue, the unreality of time, and so much more. With each thorough, unforgiving analysis, with each ambitious, loving essay, Ms. Gabbert not only extracts self and world understanding from within the reader, but she manages to insert herself without ego into every line with such natural potency as to elicit a sensation of comfortability. This comfort is astonishing due to the far-reaching and stirring topics in each essay. It almost feels like the reader has gone for a stroll in the park and met Miss Gabbert by happenstance, struck up a conversation, and gotten to know the person and her thoughts in the same amount of time it might take to finish a round of nearby bocce ball. The Unreality of Memory is astounding, startling, and intriguing, but most of all, it is human. To me, if an artistic work hopes to achieve anything, it should be to move the reader to feel or act upon something, idea, or sentiment presented in the writing. Ms. Gabbert, with her essays depicting memory, disaster, and doom, has achieved this and more. With each essay, I learned about my own understanding of the current moment and became increasingly convicted of what role we are playing in this dehumanizing, distrustful, unreal American society. I cannot count the number of sentences I underlined and annotated. Upon rereading many sections of the book, I came back to these annotations with renewed awe. There is never a word out of place, an idea unclarified, or a doubt unacknowledged. Ms. Gabbert writes with fearlessness. She is unabashed to convict herself as much as her subject. Her words feel like a love note from ponderation to page. The synthesis of her themes seem as effortless as the reader's reception. With how intellectual her topics of choice and how thorough her utilization of outside sources are, the book could easily feel like a textbook or an academic dissertation. But with Ms. Gabbert's lyrical implementation of fact prose, reading The Unreality of Memory is, on the contrary, the complete opposite. The book, in all its intelligence, is an interpersonal reflection on our current moment. It is an exploration of what it means to be alive, to be reacting to these disasters and reality, to be partakers in the nonsense we observe on a daily basis. It is an expressive piece of art. In our current reality, there is a lack of truth and consensus reality. Our society cannot seem to agree upon one way of approaching the problems we are facing, and this leads us to feel increasingly detached and unreal within our own relationships, self-perceptions, and daily interactions. What if there was a way to breach this disconnectedness? What if it were possible to come to an agreement about what's the best way to move forward? If it were, the first step, I think, would be to acknowledge our disastrous tendency to look at events from our and only our understanding and to reach humility in reconciling our doomed future, thereby perhaps bringing a far apart people back together again. The unreality of memory challenges us to consider the unreliability of our personal reflections and the haunting imperceptibility of our past and present doomsdays. There is a lot of ambiguity moving forward. What will post-vaccinated America look like? When or will events, work, and school go back to normal? Is there a normal to return to? Should we aim to return to normal if what it stemmed from was a system based upon racial and economic oppression? With all of these unknowns and the uneasiness felt by many, including myself, regarding the present and our not so distant future, it would be possible, expected even, to read essays like this that analyze disaster and feel affirmed in fear, dreadful of reality. However, Ms. Gabbert, with this book, has accomplished something few writers have. It is the deliverance of masterful writings about disconcerting events and observations in a voice that captures the essence of what it means to be alive right now and to be trying to make sense of the daily ins and outs of this nonsensical, wonderfully flawed thing called life. I am more than honored to be introducing Elisa Gabbert today. Her writing has spoken to me in numerous ways. Thank you for coming and for sharing your work with all of us.
Sorry, I'm like speechless. Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. That was incredibly moving. And thank you all for inviting me and for coming to listen to me tonight. I'm really, really happy to be here. Yeah, one of the very disappointing things about having a book come out last year was that I didn't really get to do as many events like this in person and talk to people about the book and just talk to people as I would have liked. And the thing I'm going to be reading later actually is about that. It's about missing strangers and faces. And so we'll get to that. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Even though I can't be there. And I am going to talk a little bit before my reading about how poetry informs my essays. So this is a little craft talk that I have nicknamed The Leap. So when The Unreality of Memory came out, which as you all know was last year, I did a lot of interviews, and one of the things that almost invariably came up when people asked me about the book was, oh, you're a poet. You've published several books of poetry. How does being a poet, how does your poetry inform your essays? And to be honest, at first I was kind of bored by that question, maybe just because I got it so many times. But I was also like a little bit offended by it. Because I think to me, it, it suggested that people were thinking of me as a poet first, as an essayist second. And I was like, oh, well, so does that mean you don't take my essays seriously? Do you think that they're like this precious little side project that I'm doing? Or maybe it could even be seen as a disadvantage. Like, I don't have the skills to sustain an argument or a reader's attention in this kind of long form genre because, you know, the poetry units of the line and the stanza are very different from the sentence, the paragraph, the prose section. So I would bristle. And yet, you know, when I read reviews of my work, which you probably shouldn't do, but I did, I found that critics, readers did not share these assumptions at all about poets as essayists. They would frequently mention the fact that I'm a poet just as a kind of trivia, almost as if it were like a strange or dangerous job, like I was a crab fisherman or worked at a toll booth. I once read that those were the two most dangerous jobs. Or they would actually treat it like a special advantage, like almost an unfair advantage because, well, oh, of course these essays are well written, she's a poet. As though, you know, all that goes into writing an essay is felicity with language. So I was always a little bit surprised by that. And this has been a real point of debate in like my group chats. I've had arguments over this on Twitter, which is, does being a poet make you a better essayist? Some people think it does. Some people think, no, not at all. Mary Ruefle is somebody that I tend to think of as a poet first and an essayist second because I read her poetry before I read her essays, but I do actually prefer her essays. If you haven't read her essays, they're super fantastic. Madness, Wreck and Honey, super amazing book. But I know that her essays have found a much wider readership than her poetry. And you know, I found this to be true for myself too. More people have bought my essay collections than my poetry collections. In an interview once, I heard Mary Ruefle say that poetry is private and prose is public. That prose is public language. And it's almost as though the private language of poetry is like a dialect that not everyone speaks. Another writer I know has said that people love essays and novels by poets because they don't want to read poetry. And so therefore, when poets write in this other form, they get special access to poets without having to touch the poems. Another line he said that I really love was, people hate poets, but they love ex-poets. He would not allow me to attribute that to him by name. Anyway, to get back to the question, how does poetry inform my essays? At first, I wasn't sure that it actually did. I kind of felt like, well, these are just two different modes. I'm a completely different person, a different writer when I come to the page, depending on what form I want to write in. But I wanted to be a good, interviewee. So I would come up with an answer and I would say, oh, writing poetry makes me extra attuned to the micro effects of language and punctuation. Like when you're writing a poem, there's less text on the page. So every tiny little thing seems to matter more. So I'm paying more attention to all those things because I'm a poet. Things like a comma that you're using for rhythm or for a pause instead of like for strict grammar reasons. Edmund Morris calls this a Luftpause comma. I love that term from the musical notation mark for a breath mark. But that's actually not unique to poets. Gary Lutz or James Salter, these are prose writers who care intensely about every single comma and word and the rhythm of the sentences. So it was an answer. It wasn't a great answer, but it did give me a chance to talk about something that I personally find interesting. Like I really like punctuation. I wrote a poetry column all about punctuation a few months back. That was really fun. And it was a way that I could geek out about like parentheses and semicolons, like things that I love. So it was kind of like after a round of doing all of these interviews that I had this like sudden change of heart. And I was like, wait, of course, being a poet informs my essays. Like, what have I been thinking? I thought of all these different other ways that it has changed the way that I come to the page when I write an essay. It was just sort of like these things were happening subconsciously in whispers off stage, blinking lights, Morse code. It was in the background and I wasn't paying attention until somebody asked me the question enough times that I was like, oh, right, this actually is an interesting question. So I want to share a few ways that I think being a poet has kind of presented strategies, sort of accidental strategies that I didn't know I was using that I think can make your prose more interesting. Even if you never write poetry, have never written it, never plan to write it. I think, of course, in terms of nonfiction prose, but I think these things really apply to anything, fiction too. I'm not sure if there's people from all genres here tonight. I hope so. People experimenting in all genres. So there are 3 of these strategies. The first one is that I wasn't trained as an essayist. I did my undergrad degrees in linguistics and cognitive science. That was at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And so I wrote a lot of papers in college. I wasn't thinking of them as like capital E essays at the time, even though papers are essentially essays. But they were on like philosophy and really a lot of philosophy actually. And then I got an MFA in poetry right after college. And it was a 3-year program and I took a lot of workshops and I took some literature classes, but I didn't take any CNF classes. I don't think I even used the acronym CNF because this was a long time ago. It wasn't in like high circulation back then. I didn't take any essay classes or workshops. I was just taking poetry workshops. So essentially I was never in a formal setting where somebody like taught me how to write an essay, and I never learned it like as a craft. Now, again, of course, this could easily be seen as a disadvantage because I wasn't trained and I didn't know what I was doing. But I think not knowing what you're doing can really make your writing more distinctive. Because I wasn't trying to measure up to the essays that I had been assigned as models. I hadn't like read a lot of essays at an impressionable young age that made me think like, oh, this is what essays are, and this is what I have to write. I was really just, trying to write something in my own voice. I was thinking on the page, and I was trying to be interesting in a way that I thought other people might find interesting too. So, but I want to be really clear that I'm not saying like, don't read, don't take classes, quit your program, drop out. I'm not saying that. Reading is super, super important. And in a lot of ways, like I feel perpetually behind because I never sort of read the standard issue CNF syllabus. And just as an example, like of all the many holes in my reading background, I've never read the Annie Dillard essay about the eclipse, like which, remember when there was the total eclipse a few years ago? Like everybody was talking about it all the time. And I was like, yeah, I've never read it. And I still didn't read it, but I will get to it. I promise I will. I just didn't want to read it when everybody was talking about it. But anyway, the point is like, I've always like come to things just when I've come to them. And, often it's felt like, oh, this was the exact right time to read this. Like I was really ready to read this now. And I didn't always feel like that about the stuff that I read in college or grad school, because I just read it when I had to read it instead of sort of stumbling upon it on my own. But again, I'm not going to tell you to like go back in time and get untrained. I wouldn't recommend that. But I do think that you can achieve similar effects just by reading really, really widely outside of the genre that you primarily study and write in. So, a good way to do that is to write in 2 genres. So you're always being pulled in more than one direction, but just, read whatever, basically. Like, wouldn't it be great if you could be influenced by poets and philosophers and novelists just as much as you are by other essayists when you're writing an essay? I think so. I think that kind of broader influence really shows. Yeah. Okay. 2. The second accidental strategy. So this is about gaps. omissions or elisions or lacunae for being fancy, or synapses, which are the gaps that facilitate communication between nerve cells. If you read poetry, and I hope you do, you know that poetry depends very, very heavily on gaps. There's the very obvious visual gap created on the page by the line break. So there's all that extra white space all around the page. And even though it's nothing, it's just white space, it's literally nothing, people are kind of frightened by it. It seems to hold mysterious meaning and power. So it's doing something, right? I love this thing that I read Susan Sontag wrote in her journal about Elizabeth Hardwick. Someone said to condemn Lizzie's prose, it's as if she left out every other line. A good idea. This reminds me strongly of the surrealist party game known as Exquisite Corpse, or sometimes Exquisite Cadaver. And I hope you all played this, but it's sometimes a drawing game, sometimes a writing game. But you take a piece of paper and you pass it around, and each guest adds a little bit to the work and then folds the paper, partially hiding what they've added, and then passes it on. The next person has to build on the drawing or the poem, and then they fold the paper again, and then so on and so forth. So essentially, when you get to the very end, there's this composition that nobody has seen the whole of while they were composing. And I really like when poetry has this quality, you know, even when a single person writes a poem that, of course, they've been able to see the whole thing the whole time. It has this quality like the poem keeps getting away from itself. From line to line, it makes sense, but then 3 lines ahead, you never could have conceived that it would have gotten there, because it's just speeding too fast ahead of you. So when you're a working poet, haha, you get very comfortable with gaps. And I think because I'm a poet, I've always been really comfortable with gaps in my prose too. And I think that people who start off writing essays maybe don't have that same kind of like comfort with gaps, or like just that sort of like bilingual, I know what gaps do, I know what gaps mean, they're a language of their own. And so, and I often run into friction with editors when like they always want to kind of edit out the gaps by putting more words in, essentially. Like, don't you need something more here to explain how you got from point A to point B? And I'm often like, no, I don't need anything more there, because I mean, I just think it's so much like subtler and sexier if you let the transition speak for itself. And by transition, I mean the lack of transition. Like, again, like a line break, just having nothing be there. But what happens, I think, is the reader has to supply their own transition, their own reason for why you moved from point A to point B. And those might be equally valid reasons. And that makes the text a lot more open, I think. So the reader feels involved, it feels like they're participating. They would be like, if they were going to tell a friend about it or talk to another friend who read it, they would be able to say like, I think she did this because XYZ, and the other person might disagree because like, it's not all on the page, which is just so much more fun. It's almost like when you're talking about a movie and everything is not completely spelled out. So I think that creates this kind of like generosity and fellow feeling between the writer and the reader. So if you're not a poet, how do you do that? One way, of course, is to write like a lyric essay or a fragmentary essay, which naturally has a lot of gaps. I can love those. I often love those. I love a lot of really fragmentary texts. I've written some fragmentary texts. I do think that they're harder to do well than like it looks. Like, I think fragments really have to be motivated. And it's tempting to like write a bunch of notes and lines, and then, you know, you've got this like note dump document and just be like, it's done. It's a fragmentary essay, which is not always what fragments want to be. You know, sometimes notes and fragments want to be something more, you know, like Louis Kahn holding up the brick, like even a brick wants to be something. But yeah, which is, you know, I don't want to overly shit on fragments, but I do think that they're harder than they look to do successfully. But, you know, I have often when, you know, like with somebody sends me an essay that they want me to read, or if I'm like judging an essay contest or something, you know, sometimes I'm reading an essay that is like, it's not truly fragments, but the sections are really, really short. And I think like the trade-off there is that you're breaking momentum. But I've often found that if you literally just remove the section breaks and do nothing else, like literally nothing else except remove the section breaks, it's great. Like it creates this wonderful momentum and this strange feeling that like, oh, I'm just being pulled along like by a storyteller who's going from one topic to another and not completely explaining where they're going. And it really like, it works better in writing than it would in storytelling somehow. Like you're more willing to just go with it. Like you see that paragraph break and you're like, oh, now we're in a new paragraph. And we're talking about something different. And it's very like mysteriously wonderful. So my advice is like, if your essays have a ton of section breaks, try just taking them out and doing nothing else different and see what happens. Like don't write informal transitions. The transitions are just there. I do think so that's a kind of gap. It's not actually white space on the page. It's just like sort of a gap in explanation. I think those gaps help create like mystery and mood is really, really important for essays. I have a pet theory that like mood and structure are the two most important things to keep an essay interesting over, you know, 2, 3, 5,000 words. And people tend to have like a strength, one or the other. Like they're really good at writing a very structured essay, but there's no mood, or they can create a lot of great mood, but there's no structure. So it's good to kind of know what your strength is so you can work on the other one. All right, okay, so the third accidental strategy connects back to what my anonymous friend said about people hating poets or hating poetry. You may know that Ben Lerner, who is another like ex-poet, better known for his prose now, wrote a book called The Hatred of Poetry. So I think that, you know, a lot of people don't like reading poems. This has been my experience because they feel like they don't speak that private language and they feel like they should understand it because it's in English or whatever the language it is that they speak, that they're reading in. But still there's this barrier to understanding that makes them feel uncomfortable. And it's just much more of a barrier than when they're reading prose. And even poets, like, I think don't love reading poetry all the time. It's like, it's often not like their comfort reading, you know? So as a poet, I'm often like sort of very conscious of this resistance. You know, maybe it's not hatred, sometimes it's hatred, but if not hatred, just a little resistance on the part of the reader, maybe a little bit of a hostility or a suspicion to like, what are you doing? Why are you doing these weird things with language and form? And so when I'm writing a poem, I'm always kind of like trying to trick the reader a little bit into staying interested. I'm like trying to come up with a way to keep them reading, even though the line breaks are probably pissing them off. And so I do this by trying to like constantly surprise them. So gaps, as we mentioned, are like one way to be surprising, but there's tons of ways to be surprising, right? So Brian Dillon, who I have probably like unintentionally cited tonight, if not by name, because I love him. He's just a really great critic. He said that Elizabeth Hardwick's word choices were precise but unpredictable. And there is that feeling when you're reading her sentences that like, you could never guess that she was going to end that sentence with that word, you know. Hart Crane is another writer who's known for like very weird eclectic diction. I always remember my thesis advisor when I got my MFA would talk about this Hart Crane line, mustard scansions of the eye. And he was just like, what the hell does that mean? It's like, you know what mustard is, and you know what scansions are if you're a poet, and you know what the eye is, but like mustard scansions of the eye makes absolutely no sense. It's certainly memorable though. I've never forgotten that. But this brings me to the title of this little lecture, which is The Leap. My favorite way to be surprising is this move that I call the leap. And It's not the same as the volta, which is like this little turn that occurs in the sonnet, usually either between the two, the sestet and the octet, or before the final couplet. It's a little different from that. And I think that a poem can take multiple leaps. But I love when it happens around like the third line of a poem, because I think that's right about where the reader gives up. Like if they're not interested, they are like, well, I'm ready to move on. I've read 3 lines of this poem and it doesn't mean anything to me. So if you suddenly do something that like gets their attention, it's like a little dance step or a party trick, it changes everything. And it makes you raise your eyebrows, is sometimes how I think of it, or like sit up in your chair, or even like feel a little afraid. And I want to read just the first few lines of a poem that I always think of when I'm thinking about the leap, because it's so bizarre. So this is by John Woodward, called Salamander. I read this many, many years ago, and it's probably the poem that I've like made other people read the most. I'm not even going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read like the first 7 lines. Salamander. The janitor asked me how to pronounce the creature's name, and I said salamander for him. He looked at it on the screen, and I looked at him. Slide your legs into its tail, I said. I can't, he said, as he did. Yeah, so that the moment of that poem, like it makes me afraid. It's like, what's happening? What reality are we in? So yeah, if I'm writing a poem, I think about that poem and I'm like, why is this so boring? Why is nothing happening? Why am I not having any ideas? And then I'm like, oh, right, I haven't taken the leap yet. So I think that you can do the leap in essays. I think of it less as something that happens like between lines, and maybe something that happens more like between paragraphs, or maybe between like sections. Or I sometimes think of the parts of an essay as like movements, like between the first and second movement. There can be a turn, to, again, use that poetic word, like a turn where it's suddenly like, oh, I didn't think this was going to go there. So it's kind of like a supercharged gap, like a gap on steroids. So it's not like you're on a flagstone path and you're just jumping from one stone to the next, but it's like you're suddenly veering onto a completely different path, or you're just chopping a brand new path through the forest. Like you're just going off in a direction that the reader could not possibly have anticipated, but it's not like so random and zany that they're like, wait, what? You totally lost me. It's like, it has to be connected, but not obviously connected. So, oh yeah, I want to share a few fun quotes. The poet Catherine Cowles once said in an interview, once I start writing poems, I already know how to write. I end up just rewriting poems I've already written, only not quite as well. It's only when I try something completely new with the distinct possibility of profound failure that I find I am able to write my way into a better kind of thinking. And a similar line by Joy Williams from a really wild craft essay. The moment a writer knows how to achieve a certain effect, the method must be abandoned. The writer's style is his doppelganger, an apparition that the writer must never trust to do his work for him. I love that, because I do feel like if I get a little too comfortable in like a certain style or structure, it becomes very easy and rote for me to produce those. Like I'm just sort of following my own formula, because I've gotten a little too good at it. So I have to try kinds of different structures or approaches or different kinds of leaps in order to keep it interesting and like make sure that I'm still learning something. And an example of that from the Unreality of Memory is the witch essay, which is the longest essay in the book. I had like too much material and I didn't know how to fit it into like my standard like 3 to 4 section structure. And so I ended up grouping related material into these like little short titled sections, which is a move that I just totally ripped off from Crowds and Power by Canetti, which is an amazing book, especially to read like in the age of social media. It's so powerfully relevant. but yeah, so I had to try like a new kind of structure to make that essay work. And I thought that I might like remove the structure in the end, but I ended up really liking the scaffolding and I just left it in. So I'm drawing to the end of this little lecture. And so I do want to kind of acknowledge that I made it sound like they were different strategies. They're really all sort of the same thing, which is like, I'm just trying to avoid being obvious whenever I'm writing. That's like my main goal. So, and I think writing poetry is pretty good training for that. All right, so I am now going to transition into a brief reading. First, I have to wet my mouth. It's getting a little sticky there. All right. So first I was planning to read something from Unreality, but I read a lot from that book and it occurred to me like, oh, I mean, I think most of you have read it. So maybe it would be more exciting for me to read something new. It's in a similar style. I think it's the piece that I've written since the book came out that is like most in the style of those essays. But I did actually, and everybody always says like, oh, it's crazy that she didn't write this book during the pandemic because it's like about pandemics and everything. So this is my actual pandemic essay that I started working on during the pandemic. And I'm sort of just kind of doing the final tinkering. It's going to be published in a couple of months, but I mostly finished it like in winter. So yeah, I don't think I have time to read the whole thing. I'll just read a few sections. So this is called A Complicating Energy, Notes on a Year Without Strangers. There's a particular stranger from deep in my past I remember. I was 6 years old in a playroom at some kind of day camp. I saw a pretty brunette girl standing with a group of her friends. She struck me as older and more sophisticated than I was, though she couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She met my gaze and asked me, "Do you have a staring problem?" I was shocked, ashamed, and understood that I should not look at people for long. But I still stare at strangers. I still have a staring problem. I used to see strangers every day when I commuted to an office on a train. Often I couldn't get a seat, and though I always carried a book, I rarely opened it. The trips were short, the cars were full, and I was never bored. I spent the time looking at the other passengers, their outfits, what they were reading, the interesting neutrality of their train expressions, unrevealing of their interiors. 10 years ago, when I started working from home, I didn't miss seeing my coworkers exactly, at least not as specific people. But I found I miss seeing people in general. I missed the strangers on the train. So I'd wander around a mall after work or go to concerts or museums. Friday night openings are barely about the art. They're about looking good in public. In his 1712 essay, 24 Hours in London, Richard Steele writes, "I could not believe any place more entertaining than Covent Garden, where I strolled from one fruit shop to another with crowds of agreeable young women around me who were purchasing fruit for their respective families." The 18th century convention of capitalizing nouns transforms these women with their fruit into Platonic ideals. It's as if he was delighted by their very interchangeability. To people watch, says Baudelaire, is to see the world, to be at the center of the world, and yet to remain hidden from the world. To become interchangeable, one of the strangers. For Virginia Woolf, a wander through the city at dusk was an escape from the trap of being tethered to a single mind, from the oppression of self. The evening hour, too, gives us the irresponsibility which darkness and lamplight bestow. We are no longer quite ourselves. Let us dally a little longer, she writes, be content still with surfaces only. Strangers are all surface. And if we accessed their depths, they'd cease to be strangers. We're all surface to them too, all face. Strangers allow us to be mysterious in a way we can't when we're at home or when alone. With strangers, we're unknown. For over a year now, I have not been seeing enough faces. My dreams have become crowded, creating company for me. I go to dream parties and talk to old friends, sometimes very old friends, people I haven't been in touch with for decades, and make out with dream strangers. I heard once that strangers you see in your dreams are all real people from your past, people you've walked by on the street or in other fleeting encounters, but how could you ever prove this? A writer I know told me she's been searching for faces online so she can work on her novel. I've never had to do this before, but it's like I can't see my characters anymore. I can't remember the tiny details people have on their faces. The same day, another friend shared a photo with me writing, "Last night I saw a woman feeding this cat, and I stopped to tell her how I saw it sunning itself in this chair. Best interaction all week." Another, "One of the things my students mentioned missing the most from pre-COVID days was just seeing strangers and smiling at them in passing." I used to read a blog by the psychologist Seth Roberts, where he documented the results of elaborate experiments in optimizing his life and daily habits to maintain a lower weight, to achieve better sleep and better moods. One of the odder things he discovered was what he called morning faces therapy. If I see faces in the morning, I feel better the next day. It's as though we have a basic need to see other people, a recommended daily intake of humanity. Roberts believed he could satisfy this need by watching talking heads on TV or YouTube, but I'm not so sure. I think we need faces that can see us too. One day last July, I saw a letter from a reader in the Baltimore Sun that made me gasp. My 8-year-old was sobbing last night because she misses playing with her friends at recess. She misses her teacher, and she is worried that everyone has forgotten her, this mother wrote. At one point, she asked me if she was even real anymore. I felt profound recognition with this child's crisis. The self cannot be too much with itself, it seems. We need to be seen, or we feel transparent, even non-existent. For much of the summer, I had a near constant headache and some other sensation I couldn't describe, not even to myself. I tried to tell people what it felt like, but it was as if I had a tumor in the exact part of my brain that would have given me the language to define it. The sensation was in my head mostly, but it was separate from the pain. It felt related to lightheadedness, but it wasn't lightheadedness. It might have been the opposite. Sometimes I felt like my brain was a little too big for my skull, or that it was ringing, the way ears can ring, or reverberating, like when you accidentally bite down hard on the tines of a metal fork. I'd been having insomnia on and off, but one week my sleep was disrupted in disturbing new ways. I would start to drift off, then be jolted awake as if someone had stabbed an adrenaline syringe into my heart. I had the terrifying thought that if I did fall asleep, I would die, and that my body somehow knew this and was trying to keep me alive. The next day, exhausted, I described the sensation in very vague terms to a woman I work with. She asked me whether it felt like I was being electrocuted from the inside. I was stunned. It had felt like that. After our phone call, I Googled something like electric shock feeling while falling asleep. I found an article about brain zaps, which are typically a symptom of antidepressant withdrawal. But I have never taken antidepressants. Could it be that I was in withdrawal from my own normal brain chemistry, I wondered? My pre-pandemic levels of serotonin and endorphins? My intrinsic antidepressants? I Googled the symptoms of morphine withdrawal. Anxiety, rapid heart rate, troubled sleeping. They sounded like the symptoms of anything. Finally, I made a telehealth appointment with my doctor, who ordered a series of tests. She thought it sounded like anxiety, but I was sure there was something else wrong with me. Cancer, cirrhosis. In bed at night, I sobbed into my husband's shirt in fear, but everything came back normal. My doctor prescribed a beta blocker to take before sleep, and the panicky feeling in my chest went away, along with the weird sensation in my skull. At the time, I was immersed in what I thought of as the literature of despair. I read William Styron's Darkness Visible, the novelist's memoir of his suicidal depression. Depression is a disorder of mood, Styron writes, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, to the mediating intellect, as to verge close to being beyond description. While Styron is in France to receive a major prize, he feels in his mind a sensation close to, but indescribably different from, actual pain. Oh, I thought, I see. This pain that can't be named is well established. But Styron, while he was afflicted, didn't understand it either. He felt a vague interior doom that drove him to the doctor for weeks of high-tech, extremely expensive tests, which deemed him totally fit. In Suppose a Sentence, the critic Brian Dillon notes that Charlotte Bronte suffered much from loneliness and the frustration of unfulfilled literary ambitions. But she described her own malady as hypochondria, which did not mean, or did not mean only what it does today, but rather referred to a melancholic condition that we now call anxiety or depression. Hypochondria etymologically means under the sternal cartilage. Victorian physicians believed there was some digestive component to this condition that gave the sufferer a visionary or exaggerated sense of pain, in the words of Thomas John Graham's 1826 Manual, Modern Domestic Medicine. The contemporary sense of hypochondria, a restless and unfounded health anxiety, is a linguistic narrowing and clearly pejorative. You think you're sick, but it's all in your head and not in your sternum. In a graphic essay called What Do We Lose When We Stop Touching Each Other?, the illustrator Kristen Radke describes moving to a driving city at age 25, a city strung with interstates and very few sidewalks. In this environment, there was no accidental touching, no stumbling into another body when the bus jerked to a stop, no brushing a shoulder as I passed someone on the sidewalk. She was living alone. Without touching strangers, she touched no one at all. In another essay, Radke describes asking people what they've missed most about touch during the pandemic. Someone responds, I used to wash hair at a salon. One woman would moan slightly when I touched her head. She found ways to extend her hair washing time, which I was already extending because she obviously needed it. One day she told me, my husband is dead and I have no children or grandchildren. You're the only one who touches me. Radke notes that receiving regular hugs has been shown to ease symptoms of the flu. Isolation reduces your chances of contracting a virus, but if you do, it may make your illness feel worse and last longer. Part of the unfairness of loneliness is that it often deprives us of touch. Psychologists call this need for touch skin hunger. A year or two ago, if your skin hunger was intense, you could hire a professional cuddler. I watched a video about one professional cuddler who noted that talk therapy is helpful for those experiencing loneliness, but that conventional therapists are not allowed to touch their clients. So touch-deprived people may need a different service. The next video served up by the YouTube algorithm was a BuzzFeed video called People Spoon with Professional Cuddlers for the First Time. I watched that too. In these videos, the professionals, some of them employed by a company called Cuddlist, talk through the process. First, you have to sign an agreement stating that the encounter will remain non-sexual. Then you do an activity called companioning, just sitting side by side for a bit, not touching. Dramatic music plays over the cuddling footage. A woman in a blue shirt tells her cuddler, I feel like I always wanted a sister growing up, and so I love it when people play with my hair because it feels like having a sister. Watching these videos, I kept recalling specific times I'd been touched in the past. I remembered a school assembly in 2nd or 3rd grade when a boy's shirt brushed against my arm. I remembered sitting on the balcony at a party in my 20s when the man I had a crush on came outside and rested his palm on the top of my head. I sometimes think touch on the face or the head is the most memorable kind of touch. Maybe because our selfhood seems to emanate from there. What has happened to the professional cuddling industry? What about massage parlors? From time to time, I've wondered this about some industry or other. Life has changed in many ways I haven't kept up with. I checked the Cuddlist website. It said they were offering virtual sessions, which sort of made me want to cry, even though I had someone to touch me in person for free. I'll stop there.
Thanks,
Well,
Elisa. Do we want to, that was really wonderful. I want to give our students a chance to ask you some questions that they've been thinking about over the last few weeks. Katie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I can't wait to read that whole essay. So amazing. I had a couple questions prepared, but something you said in your introduction really intrigued me, and I actually wanted to ask you to elaborate on it. So you were talking about mood and structure in essay writing, and I kind of wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit and explain what you mean by, having strengths in either one and learning to bring out one or the other if we struggle with that.
Yeah. I was going to say, I kind of want to elaborate on that too, but what I mean is like, I need to think about it more. Because this occurred to me, I don't know, a few months ago. And I was like, ooh, this is something that I feel like I could like develop an essay around or something, because I'm very interested in these two elements of essays. And I haven't put as much thought into it as I would like to. But it started with just thinking that a lot of essays lack mood. So I think it's just sort of an underrated thing that not that many people talk about. I mean, we use the word mood a lot, but I don't hear it spoken about a lot in regards to like a craft element. And I just noticed that often when I like click on an article online, within 2 paragraphs, I'm just sort of like, I just have this feeling like, I don't want to keep reading this. And the feeling is usually that like it hasn't created a mood to like invite me in. Like it's not telling me this is the kind of party you're at. You know what I mean? Like the way like lighting and what drinks are served and the costumes that people are wearing tell you what kind of party you're at. Like sometimes essays don't take the time to do that. And I just think it's really, really important. It's sort of related to the idea of like tricking people into reading your poems, like, but it's just this like atmospheric thing. Like I think of essays as very spatial, like it's like a space that you're in with a writer. And when I'm writing an essay, I feel like I'm like wandering around a space and I can only get so far, but I can get pretty far and I have to come back to the kind of center of the space. So I started thinking about it in terms of like, well, this is something that's really important. Like if I love an essay and if I start an essay and like I know that I've started in the right place, it's because I know I'm creating a certain mood. But then I was reading an essay that like a friend had asked me to read that I felt it was really long and had a great mood. It was amazing. It was about like growing up near like a Kodak Eastman factory, and like there was like chemical pollution in the environment and like how the water would turn weird colors and there was always weird smells. And so it was like this really long essay with all these associations and memories and like unexplained phenomena and like history of that company and of the little industrial town that she grew up in. So it was like a 10 on mood, but it had that problem of a bunch of short sections. So it didn't have like enough momentum to carry me through. It was like a 10,000 word essay. And so like what I told her to do was like to actually cut out the sections and like group them into a smaller number of groups based on like, oh, I think that you have a few sections that are related to the body and a few sections that are related to the different smells, and just to like group them together so she could find a way to just essentially have fewer sections, because the sections kept kind of like stopping me. Like, it's like when you're, you know, you're cruising along and then there's a red light, and if you keep hitting red lights, it's just really annoying, you know? So that's what it felt like to me as a reader. It was like I kept hitting red lights. So I thought that she could have a more elegant structure by having longer sections. So these are just some examples of people who I think if you read a lot of articles, like for online publications, you get really good at structure because the structures are sort of formulaic. So yeah, I mean, it is subjective. I don't know how you might be able to determine your own strengths other than just like reading essays for a little while, trying to think like, oh, I think this essay has really good mood, but no structure. I think this essay has great structure, but no mood. And that might help you kind of identify those two elements, which are sort of competing, but I don't think they have to compete. They can work together.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you so much. Do I have time for a second question, or should I mean, I can give the floor to someone else. Does anybody know?
You go ahead.
Okay. I just don't want to like take too much time. I'll just read one more of my other questions I had prepared about the unreality of memory. So in The Great Mortality, which was my favorite of the essays, you wrote, quote, "We make stupid decisions because we think, having come this far as a culture, as a species, we're indestructible. On some unexpected level, I almost fear we are," end quote. And I'm very fascinated by this attitude of exceptionalism, particularly because of its prevalence in our society. And I think the essay is striking in its relation to America's obsession with growth and progress and our inaction against climate change and individualist tendencies and everything. And these are also being reflected in our response to the pandemic in a lot of ways. So I'm curious about what fascinates you personally about this belief in our own indestructibility, and how and if our current moment has influenced how you think about those things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about all this stuff, obviously, like kind of during the Trump presidency, and then, you know, even more so in 2020. And I had sort of come to think that like we had just reached this like quicksand stage of civilization where like the speed of like true advancement, true technological advancement in the 20th century was so just, you know, put you into a tailspin. Like people didn't know how to process it. Like going from not having trains to having trains, and then having cars, and then like, you know, the human lifespan like doubled, and then we went to the moon. Like, but like all within, you know, like 75 years or something. Like that's something that we can't really imagine, because, you know, those of us who are, you know, somewhere between like 20 and 40 years old, like we haven't seen that kind of progress in our lifetimes. Instead, the changes that we've been forced to process are like negative change. Not in all ways. I think there's been progress in terms of like social justice in a lot of ways. Not enough, but some. But like the human lifespan hasn't gotten any longer. People are not making more money. They're not able to rest more. Like wages are stagnant, except at the very top, where people just keep getting richer and richer and richer. And meanwhile, like the chickens have really come home to roost with regard to the climate crisis. Like it used to, like, I do remember when it felt kind of theoretical. Like when I was in college, it still felt kind of theoretical. But I think, you know, no more. I think we all like the weather every day feels like climate change to us now. And that's something that nobody has really had to process in the past 200 years, except for us. So yeah, I guess I feel like we're having to develop whole new frameworks like for how to live. And I certainly haven't figured them out. And I don't think I've gotten any smarter in the past year. So like, I wish I could say, oh, I've had some great new realizations since the pandemic started and I finished that book, but I don't think I have. I think I've just been really sad. But yeah, I'm really glad that people still find the book kind of useful and meaningful, because yeah, I guess maybe there was some fear that, oh, it wouldn't feel relevant by the time it was published. I'm glad that hasn't turned out to be the case. I feel like I sort of sidestepped your question there. Sorry.
No, not at all. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And it's been an honor to listen to you read and speak with you. So I really appreciate it.
Hannah or Michael, do you want to offer one of your questions? Sorry, I put you in a spot where it's like I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, no. Hello, Elisa. Thank you for reading to us. I just wanted to ask you about your writing process and what your daily writing practice looks like, and if it looks different when you write like essays and when you write poetry, and how do you navigate that space, because a lot of your essays are very heavily researched, and it's because it speaks to large historical narratives, and I was wondering how you also balance that with your the personal aspects of your writing. So yeah.
Yeah, very different for me. I think with an essay, I like to kind of work on it for as long as possible. Like I almost think of it as like opening a file. I mean, sometimes I literally open a file when I just want to write an essay. If I want to write about, like right now I'm trying to write about crossword puzzles. So I like started a file called Crossword Notes. And the way that I approach it in the beginning is like, it's this kind of free for all, and I try to make it as fun as possible. Like I'm just following an interest. So when I'm sort of like cheating a little bit at work because I have a day job, I'll like try to read a little bit of something about crosswords, or like watch a video about how crosswords are made or something. And while I'm working on this essay, whenever I'm doing a crossword, I feel like I'm working on the essay. But basically, I'm just trying to get into a state where like I'm allowing myself to have thoughts and ideas about a certain subject, and being in that open state tends to make almost everything feel related to the thing that I'm writing about. And so I let myself just kind of keep a lot of notes for a while until I have like an almost overwhelming amount. And I start to feel like, okay, this is enough. I should stop. And I'm starting to see how like I could build a piece out of this. So yeah, so it's much slower and it's more deliberate. And I'm really kind of planning it out. I'm like sort of setting the trap for myself where I know like, well, if I start taking notes on this now, within 1 to 3 months, I can definitely write an essay, as long as I'm contributing to it somewhat regularly. And that part's really fun for me. With a poem, it's much more like, it does feel like I'm like dependent on the muse, like some kind of inspiration has to strike. I have to have like a certain line or something, or an image that's sort of obsessing me that I feel like I can build a poem around. And when I try to write a poem, I really try to do it in like one sitting, like over an hour or two. So yeah, very different, but I can get away with writing poems much less frequently since they're not as long. Let's see, what was the other part of your question? Balancing research with personal material, right? So that's almost just like, it almost started off as, I don't want to say like an insecurity, because it's not an insecurity exactly, but just a way of showing like my non-expert status on the page, because I've just always been wary of posing as a scholar, or I mean, I tend to write about areas where there are experts, but that I'm not an expert, you know, like sometimes medical stuff. There's some like medical research about like the health effects of loneliness in that essay that I read from. There's a lot of science, obviously, in the unreality of memory. And I never want anyone to think that I'm like pretending to be a scientist or to have like a PhD. And so I try to kind of insert asides and gestures and signposts around like, oh, I was just reading this book. This is what I think about this. Like, you know, just so it's clear that it's like, that's how I'm coming to the material, just as like an interested thinker versus a scholar. And yeah, I feel like people tell me that it makes it feel really personal and like they're kind of part of the essay and learning along with me. So it's just kind of become a signature move. So something I need to watch out for, clearly.
Yeah, thank you for your insight. The last question I have is, I was wondering who the ancestors are for this book and whose words you turn to while putting these essays together.
Yeah. I mean, certainly Susan Sontag, but other than that, I didn't really have an exact model. I mean, I admire people like Maggie Nelson who work in multiple genres, and sort of whenever they come to a project, like I feel like Maggie Nelson has said in interviews before, like she doesn't want to be tied down to like a certain genre. Like she doesn't sit down thinking like, I'm going to write a book of poems now, or I'm going to write a lyric essay. She's just sort of like writing about material that she's interested in, and then like finding the form as she goes. And then later people will project a category on it, like as kind of a marketing tactic. But I think that she like comes to the page feeling very free. And like earlier in my career, I was very sort of like liberated and inspired by that as a model. But yeah, I did like try as much as possible to just make this book like exactly what I wanted it to be. And I didn't have like an exact sort of comp title in mind. Yeah, I really just wanted to be like, this is my voice. This is exactly how I would approach this book, and nobody else would do it this way. I don't know. That's probably sounds really arrogant. So let's say Susan Sontag.
Yeah, well, thank you, Elisa.
Yeah.
I actually have a follow-up that's somewhat related to what Hannah had asked, and it's in keeping with something that you had mentioned in your lecture, the lecture portion of your talk, about like taking out transitions, or taking out and kind of relying upon this associative logic. And then you described an essay as a physical space that you kind of wander. You have a center and you're kind of wandering around and then pulling the reader back in. And I think that's the most charismatic element of your work. It's something that I so delight in, and particularly thinking about a vanity project. When I first read that essay, I felt there was this kind of, there's almost like exquisite tumble. Like I was being taken into every paragraph as like a new facet, or like a dark jewel with different facets or something. And I was wondering, as you were describing your research process, or kind of like the joyful mess of that first draft, whether that sort of sculpting happens in the kind of note-taking, or whether it follows chronologically the stuff that you were researching. Just like how does that sculpting start to happen, and like that I mean, I assume the poetic impulse of that kind of associative logic, but I wonder like how much, I don't know, I want to hear you describe that more, because it's super fascinating to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been really interested to hear a lot of people say that Vanity Project is either their favorite or one of their favorite essays in the book, because that's actually the earliest one that I wrote. And, you know, there were some kind of like versions of what this book could have been that wouldn't have included that essay, because like when I was trying to find a publisher, like I did talk to an editor who really wanted it to be much more tightly focused on disasters. So basically like a book-length version of section 1. And I considered that, like I wrote a proposal that would have been that book. But I did want the book to be this messier, like I feel like the book is like a space of spaces, right? Like it's that even larger space that contains these spaces where the connections between essays aren't super obvious, just like if you just read like a list of the topics, but if you actually read the essays, you see all the connections. I just imagine like Meow Wolf. I don't know if you've ever been to Meow Wolf. It's just like this giant, weird museum space. But yeah, so Vanity Project, I think that was really the essay where I kind of like just discovered by happenstance the form that so many of the other essays would take. And I would say that like, yeah, I like that essay a lot too. I have a lot of fondness for it because whatever kind of structures and moods I ended up sort of systematizing to make the essays feel cohesive, it wasn't at all systematized yet. I was totally just in discovery mode at that point. And yeah, that and the first essay, Magnificent Desolation, those were the two earliest. And I feel like I can still really see that kind of like discovery mode where it was just kind of like, well, maybe I'll talk about this in the next paragraph. I don't know. So I think there's a kind of there's a like intermediate stage, I guess, between note taking and writing where I'll sort of do an outline, but it's a very like a jellyfish of an outline. Like it does not have firm edges. It's like, and maybe I'll start here because I like the mood of this. And then maybe I'll go there, and then maybe I'll go there, maybe go there. It's almost like just like a sketchy little map. But I'm sort of allowing myself to discover things within, like it might be a map between like, I think I want to go through these 4 rooms, but I'm allowing myself to discover each room fully, like just in the writing. Because I don't really know what I want like the second sentence to be until I write the first sentence and so forth. Yeah, so I do like enjoy the discomfort zone of that, like, I don't know where I'm going with this yet stage.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the what gives the essay so much propulsion. It's something that I talk a lot about with some of these folks who are in this, whatever this space is, this pixelated room, about kind of like going into that that place of not knowing, the Donald Barthelme thing of like the not knowing. And yeah, it's really exciting. So maybe one more question. Michael, did you want to offer a question?
Sure. Hey, Lisa, thanks for joining us. This is awesome. So in your essay, The Little Room, you know, the line that really hit me hard, one of the lines that really hit me hard, but this one probably the hardest, was when you wrote, if this world was strange and magical to me then, it's even more strange and magical now for being remote. It's hard for me to believe it no longer exists. It's not a place I can go to. And, you know, it prompted me to think of all these places I cannot go to anymore. And I thought, at first I was wondering, man, how did like writing about these things affect her relationship with the present and her consciousness of the present? And then as I was putting questions together, I ran into and big and slow when you're talking about the slow violence. And you write, to look at the moving object, we have to pause it, which renders it inert, allowing us to contemplate it passively. So I was just curious with the nature of some of these essays, you digging so deep into how like ephemeral and fleeting things are in your own life. Did writing some of these essays kind of enhance how like you're able to be conscious and be attentive to detail in the present, and also like how has it complicated that for you, you know?
Yeah. I think the answer to the first part is no, probably. I don't think it's enhanced anything. I think if anything, writing makes me like more removed from things. Like, yeah, like when I write about something that I remember, like writing about the memory becomes part of the memory in this way that I then like I can't extract that out anymore. Oh yeah, it's complicated, but yeah, I've just noticed also that like the older I get, the more that I start to associate I'm trying to think of an example of like there was like a really difficult time in my life when I was around 25, and then like when I turned 26 or whatever, the next year, like around the same time of year, when the weather was about the same as when I was going through that hard time, like I felt really poignant about the previous time, you know, like, so it was like late spring and it was in Boston, and in late spring in Boston, like it's usually like cold and rainy, and like right up through May, there'll be days where it's like wet and like 40 degrees and just terrible. And so, yeah, like that year after, like I remember this one time that I was like lying in bed and the weather was like that, like it just like the cold, like the windows were open because it was spring, but the air coming in was really cold, and the light was like that weird spring light. And I just so felt like intensely, oh my God, last year hurt so much, and now I'm feeling that pain again. And like now when I think about that original pain, I don't think about the original pain at all. I think about the year after when I remembered it in the room with the wind and the curtains and like the similar feeling of the cold and the rain. I don't remember the original pain anymore. I remember the memory of the pain. And like to such a degree that like when I wanted to tell the story, I could picture that room so clearly. And I was like, what was I even thinking about? Like, what was the pain even about? Like, I had to dig back a little bit. So yeah, I think writing is similar in that like, it can almost rewrite what I was writing about, overwrite what I was writing about in a way that it becomes like almost like the final version that my mind stores, which is a little troubling. And I don't think I have thought about my grandmother's house as much as I used to since writing that essay. It's almost like it helped me put it away.
Thank you.
Well, let's give Elisa another round of applause. That was so amazing. I'm just unutterably happy that you could join us, particularly because not only has your work so resonated with our students, but I don't know. I mean, you're one of my favorite contemporary essayists, so it's truly joyful to interact with you in this space and to hear your words and to share your writing with these students who've are just so brilliant. Wonderful, wonderful questions. So thank you so much again, Elisa, for this. It's really special.
Thank you. It was really wonderful to talk with you all. I wish I could see you in person, but this is also wonderful. So thank you so much for reading and engaging with my work in such a deep and meaningful way. It's amazing.
Wonderful. All right, let's all do the wave. See you all later. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.